Hey guys, welcome back to the Adventures of Cosmic. I'm Cosmic, and today we're going to be listening to Blackmore Sisters, Dead Wrong, again. Hopefully the entire book this time. And I'm sorry, I'm so very sorry for the viewers that didn't get any audio. I didn't get any audio, that's why I'm re-recording this. You will have Dead and Buried, hopefully Dead and Buried and Dead Tide by the end of tomorrow. If not, I'll have it on the 28th, okay? Okay, thank you guys for being so patient. I'm so sorry if this is taking so long. Also, look at my new phone case! Hold on, let me take... My new phone case is so cool! Okay, and it's less bulky too, so I'm gonna be able to use my tripod. Got that from Santa Claus, people. Okay, so, a little backstory in the book. So, there's 4 sisters, Jolene, Celeste, Morgan, and Fiona. The sheriff doesn't do much to try to help them solve stuff. Doesn't solve stuff properly, so they have to do the investigation themselves. They meet new people along the way. They find out who the real killer is and get that person arrested. Okay? So let's dive in to Dead Wrong. And I hope you guys enjoy this book because I am so excited and I'm very, very sorry for not having audio last time. So let's do this. Okay, you guys ready? Start from the beginning. You guys ready? Because I'm going to be talking about this every once in a while. We're going to start with the beginning.
Dead Wrong. Blackmore Sisters Paranormal Cozy Mystery Series, Book 1. Written by Leanne Dobbs. Narrated by Hollis McCarthy. Chapter 1. Morgan Blackmore tapped her finger lightly on the counter, her mind barely registering the low buzz of voices behind her in the crowded coffee shop as she mentally prioritized the tasks that awaited her back at her own store. Here you go. 1 yerba mate tea and a vanilla latte. Felicity rang up the purchase as Morgan dug in the front pocket of her faded denim jeans for some cash, which she traded for the 2 paper cups. Inhaling the spicy aroma of the tea, she turned to leave, her long, silky black hair swinging behind her. Elbowing her way through the crowd, she headed toward the door. At this time of morning, the coffee shop was filled with locals, and Morgan knew almost all of them well enough to exchange a quick greeting or nod. Suddenly, a short, stout figure appeared, blocking her path. Morgan let out a sharp breath, recognizing the figure as Prudence Littlefield. Prudence had a long-running feud with the Blackmores, which dated back to some sort of run-in she'd had with Morgan's grandmother when they were young girls. As a result, Prudence loved to harass and berate the Blackmore girls in public. Morgan's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route. "Just who do you think you are?" Prudence demanded, her hands fisted on her hips, legs spaced shoulder-width apart. Morgan noticed she was wearing her usual knee-high rubber boots and an orange sunflower scarf. Morgan's brow furrowed over her ice-blue eyes as she stared at the older woman's prune-like face. "Excuse me?" "Don't you play dumb with me, Morgan Blackmore. What kind of concoction did you give my Ed? He's been acting plumb crazy."
You know who's acting plumb crazy, Prudence? You are! Okay, let's get back to the book.
Morgan thought back over the previous week's customers. Ed Littlefield had come into her herbal remedies shop, but she'd be damned if she'd announced to the whole town what he was after. She narrowed her eyes at Prudence. "That's between me and Ed." Prudence's cheeks turned crimson. Her nostrils flared. "You know what I think," she said, narrowing her eyes and leaning in toward Morgan. "I think you're a witch, just like your great-great-great-grandmother." Morgan felt an angry heat course through her veins. There was nothing she hated more than being called a witch. She was a doctor of pharmacology with a master herbalist's license, not some sort of spell-casting conjurer. The coffee shop had grown silent. Morgan could feel the crowd staring at her. She leaned forward, looking wrinkled old Prudence Littlefield straight in the eye. "Well now, I think we know that's not true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because if I was a witch, I'd have turned you into a newt long ago." Then she pushed her way past the old crone and fled out the coffee shop door. Fiona Blackmore stared at the amethyst crystal in front of her, wondering how to work it into a pendant. On most days, she could easily figure out exactly how to cut and position the stone, but right now, her brain was in a pre-caffeine fog. Where was Morgan with her latte? She sighed, looking at her watch. It was 8:10. Morgan should be here by now, she thought impatiently. Fiona looked around the small shop, sticks and stones, she shared with her sister. An old cottage that had been in the family for generations. It sat at one of the highest points in their town of Noquit, Maine. Turning in her chair, she looked out the back window. In between the tree trunks that made up a small patch of woods, she had a bird's-eye view of the sparkling, sapphire-blue Atlantic Ocean in the distance. The cottage sat about 500 feet inland, at the top of a high cliff that plunged into the Atlantic. If the woods were cleared, like the developers wanted, the view would be even better. But Fiona would have none of that, no matter how much the developers offered them, or how much they needed the money. Her and her sisters would never sell the cottage. She turned away from the window and surveyed the inside of the shop. One side was set up as an apothecary of sorts. Antique slotted shelves loaded with various herbs lined the walls. Dried weeds hung from the rafters, and several mortars and pestles stood on the counter, ready for whatever herbal concoctions her sister was hired to make. On her side sat a variety of gemologist tools, and a large assortment of crystals. 3 antique oak and glass jewelry cases displayed her creations. Fiona smiled as she looked at them. Since childhood, she had been fascinated with rocks and gems, so it was no surprise to anyone when she grew up to become a gemologist and jewelry designer, creating jewelry not only for its beauty, but also for its healing properties. The two sisters' vocations suited each other perfectly, and they often worked together, providing customers with crystal and herbal healing for whatever ailed them. The jangling of the bell over the door brought her attention to the front of the shop. She breathed a sigh of relief when Morgan burst through the door, her cheeks flushed, holding 2 steaming paper cups. "What's the matter?" Fiona held her hand out, accepting the drink gratefully. Peeling back the plastic tab, she inhaled the sweet vanilla scent of the latte. "I just had a run-in with Prudence Littlefield." Morgan's eyes flashed with anger. "Oh? I saw her walking down Shore Road this morning, wearing that god-awful orange sunflower scarf. What was the run-in about this time?" Fiona took the first sip of her latte, closing her eyes and waiting for the caffeine to power her bloodstream. She'd had her own run-ins with Prue Littlefield and had learned to take them in stride. "She was upset about an herbal mix I made for Ed. She called me a witch." "What did you make for him?" "Just some ginkgo, ginseng, and horny goatweed, although the latter, he said, was for Prudence." Fiona's eyes grew wide. "Aren't those herbs for impotence?" Morgan shrugged. "Well, that's what he wanted."
Hold up. What does this mean? I'm gonna search this up. Hold up. I'm gonna say it the way she said it. impotence. Holy cow. Hold up. Whoa. Oh, wow. Really? OMG. This is insane. Guys, don't you agree this is insane? Well, you learn something new every day, don't you? Okay, let's continue this book, because it's interesting.
No wonder Prudence was mad. Although, you'd think just being married to her would have caused the impotence. Morgan burst out laughing. No kidding. I had to question his sanity when he asked me for it. I thought maybe he had a girlfriend on the side. Fiona shook her head, trying to clear the unwanted images of Ed and Prudence Littlefield together. Well, I wouldn't let it ruin my day. You know how she is. Morgan put her tea on the counter, then turned to her apothecary shelf and picked several herbs out of the slots. I know, but she always seems to know how to push my buttons, especially when she calls me a witch. Fiona grimaced. Right. Well, I wish we were witches. Then we could just conjure up some money and not be scrambling to pay the taxes on this shop and the house. Morgan sat in a tall chair behind the counter and
Or put a spell on the people who make the taxes and be like, hey, let's charge people less taxes on. Let's charge this family less taxes on their property because they're nice people. And because they're struggling. So, let's do that. Also, I'm gonna get one of my puppy chows out. Yeah, my great grandma made them, so I'm gonna get the small one out because why not?
needed to measure dried herbs into a mortar. I know. I saw Eli Stark in town yesterday, and he was pestering me about selling the shop again. What did you tell him? I told him we'd sell over our dead bodies. Morgan picked up a pestle and started grinding away at the herbs. Fiona smiled. Eli Stark had been after them for almost a year to sell the small piece of land their shop sat on. He had visions of buying it, along with some adjacent lots, in order to develop the area into high-end condos. Even though their parents' early deaths had left Fiona, Morgan, and their two other sisters property rich but cash poor, the four of them agreed they would never sell. Both the small shop and the stately ocean home they lived in had been in the family for generations, and they didn't want their generation to be the one that lost them. The only problem was, although they owned the properties outright, the taxes were astronomical, and on their meager earnings, they were all just scraping by to make ends meet.
That's why their mama's been around.
All the more reason to get this necklace finished so I can get paid. Thankfully, the caffeine had finally cleared the cobwebs in her head, and Fiona was ready to get to work. Staring down at the amethyst, a vision of the perfect shape to cut the stone appeared in her mind. She grabbed her tools and started shaping the stone. Fiona and Morgan were both lost in their work. They worked silently, the only sounds in the little shop being the scrape of mortar on pestle and the hum
License in license in pharmacology. Herbalist license. Well, okay. Good to know. Thank you, Internet.
Of Fiona's gem grinding tool, mixed with a few melodic tweets and chirps that floated in from the open window. Fiona didn't know how long they were working like that when the bell over the shop door chimed again. She figured it must have been an hour or two, judging by the fact that the few sips left in the bottom of her latte cup had grown cold. She smiled, looking up from her work to greet their potential customer. But the smile froze on her face when she saw who it was. Sheriff Overton stood in the door, flanked by 2 police officers. A toothpick jutted out of the side of Overton's mouth, and judging by the looks on all 3 of their faces, they weren't there to buy herbs or crystals. Fiona could almost hear her heart beating in the silence as the men stood there, adjusting their eyes to the light and getting their bearings. "Can we help you?" Morgan asked, stopping her work to wipe her hands on a towel. Overton's head swiveled in her direction like a hawk spying a rabbit in a field. "That's her." He nodded to the 2 uniformed men who approached
Seriously,
Morgan
Brody.
hesitantly.
Seriously, Jake.
Fiona recognized one of the men as Brody Hunter, whose older brother Morgan had dated all through high school. She saw Brody look questioningly at the sheriff. The other man stood ahead.
Hold up, I gotta clean myself off. I have, like, powder everywhere from the pup chow. So I should put a towel down. So yeah, I'm clearly a messy puppy chow eater. So fair warning, it is powdery down here. So it's fine. It's just fine. The powder will wash off. In my case, I'm just gonna put this neutral towel on me. Okay, let's get back to the video.
Taller than Brody. Fiona noticed his dark hair and broad shoulders, but her assessment of him stopped there when she saw him pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Her heart lurched at the look of panic on her sister's face as the men advanced toward her. "Just what is all this about?" she demanded, standing up and taking a step toward the sheriff. There was no love lost between the sheriff and Fiona. They'd had a few run-ins, and she thought he was an egotistical bore, and probably crooked too. He ignored her question, focusing his attention on Morgan. The next words out of his mouth chilled Fiona to the core. "Morgan Blackmore, you're under arrest for the murder of Prudence Littlefield." Chapter 2. Just what is the meaning of this? Fiona stepped closer to the sheriff. The smell of stale cigarettes kept her a few paces from getting right in his face. She felt her stomach curdle as he turned his rheumy eyes on her. The ever-present toothpick bobbed up and down. "Mrs. Littlefield was found not 1/4 mile from here, murdered."
Okay.
"And what makes you think my sister did it?" she demanded, hands on hips. "Earlier this morning, Morgan was overheard telling Prudence that she wanted to turn her into a newt." Fiona wrinkled her brow. "So?" "Prudence was found with a newt stuffed in her throat. She'd been strangled." He turned to face Morgan. "Where were you 2 hours ago?" The girls exchanged glances, and Fiona looked at her watch. 2 hours ago was about when she was waiting for Morgan to come back with her coffee. "I was walking here from the coffee shop," Morgan said. "And I didn't say I wanted to turn her into a newt. I said, if I was a witch, I would have already turned her into a newt." "Close enough for me," Sheriff Overton said. "Did anyone see you walking here?" "Surely you can't be serious." Morgan stared at him incredulously. "That's just the kind of thing you say when someone pisses you off. You can't seriously think I actually killed her over a small argument in a coffee shop?" "That remains to be seen." Overton nodded at the officers. "Cuff her and get her into the car." He switched the toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other, then snickered at Fiona before turning and walking out of the shop. Fiona stared at his retreating back, trying to get her mouth to work. She whirled around at the sound of snapping handcuffs, planting herself firmly in between the officers and the door. "You can't just arrest her like this. You need more solid evidence." She glared at the two men. Brody looked down at the floor. "That's right, Brody Hunter. You should be ashamed of yourself." She turned her steely blue gaze on the other officer. "And you, whoever you are, how dare you come to our town and arrest my sister on this flimsy evidence? I'll have you brought up under charges of false arrest." Fiona was standing close to him. His height forced her to tilt her head backwards to look up into his face. She saw his gray eyes soften a little before he gently moved her aside. "Sorry, ma'am." He dipped his head at her. "Just doing my job." Then he brushed past her, tugging Morgan along behind him. Fiona stomped outside after them. She noticed, with annoyance, that they'd parked the police car sideways in the front lawn instead of just leaving it in the driveway. She stood at the side of the car, her fists clenched so hard that her nails dug into her palms painfully, and watched them put Morgan in the back seat. Bending down, she looked in through the window at her sister. "Don't worry, Morgan. They can't do this. I'll be right down to get you out." Overton walked by, pushing her aside, and the three men piled into the car, Brody and Overton in the front, and the other officer in the back with Morgan. Overton started the car and sped off, digging up a piece of their front yard with his back tire. Fiona's heart lurched as she saw Morgan turn her head and look out the back window at her. She spun around and raced back into the store, her heart pounding in her chest. Grabbing her purse, she locked up the shop and ran to her 12-year-old pickup truck. Mumbling a prayer to the starting gods, she held her breath while she pumped the gas pedal and turned the key in the ignition. Relief flooded her when the old truck sputtered to life, and she jammed it into drive and peeled out, pointing the truck in the direction of the police station. Fiona burst through the door to the police station, her curly red hair flying wildly behind her. Storming over to the counter, she pounded on the top, catching the attention of George O'Neill, who gave her a sympathetic look. "I demand to see my sister," she yelled, accentuating the words by pounding on the counter even louder. George took a step back and held his hands up, palms out. "Whoa there, Fiona. I know you're upset, but you need to calm down." "I'll handle this, George," someone said from behind her, and she whirled around to confront him. It was the officer that had arrested Morgan, the one she'd never seen before. Fiona had heard talk that some fancy cop from Boston had taken a job on their small-town police force, which was strange because most cops were trying to get out of Noquit and move to the big city. Not too many people moved to Noquit from other places, and Fiona had an instant distrust of anyone who did. Probably some big scandal in his past, or maybe Overton had brought him in to help corrupt the town. "Just who are you?" She narrowed her eyes at him. "Jake Cooper." Fiona eyed the hand he stuck out at her suspiciously, then placed her own hand inside it. His handshake was firm, his hand large and calloused. She had to admit the feeling wasn't all too unpleasant. But she didn't have time to dwell on that. She was on a mission. "And you are?" he prompted. She ripped her hand away. "Fiona Blackmore, and I want to see my sister, now." "I'm sorry, but she's being processed. You can't see her until visiting hours at 5 p.m., he said softly. "What do you mean I can't see her? You can't just keep her in there alone. I mean, doesn't she get a phone call or something?" Fiona blinked away tears of frustration. "I'm sorry." Jake spread his hands. "That's the rule. I promise you she's being treated well. I mean, heck, she seems to be old friends with everyone back there. They'll take good care of her." Jake's soothing tone and words of comfort had the opposite effect on Fiona. She felt her anger rising and took a step closer to him. "Look, buddy, I don't know what's going on here, or who you people think you are, but I do know that you can't arrest my sister on this flimsy evidence." Fiona wondered if they had some other evidence they had not told her about, but brushed away the thought. She knew Morgan didn't kill Prudence. She saw a flicker of something in Jake's eyes. Understanding? Guilt? Compassion? He leaned in toward her, lowering his voice. "Listen, if I were you, I'd go home and calm down, get a decent lawyer, then come back this afternoon, and you should be able to get her out," he said, glancing over at the desk as if to make sure no one heard him. Fiona was taken aback. Was he trying to help her? Or was this all part of their trap? Suddenly, she felt alone, confused and helpless. Why were they trying to blame this on Morgan? "I don't know what you people are up to," she said, taking a step closer to the tall officer. "But if you think my sister did this, you are dead wrong." She punctuated the last two words by poking her index finger hard at his chest, her eyes widening in surprise at the solid muscle she felt. Or was that his Kevlar vest? Jerking her finger away before she could contemplate it further, she turned and fled out of the station. Flinging open the door to her truck, she tumbled inside, shaking so hard she could barely get her key in the ignition. As she drove away, she remembered what Jake had said about getting a lawyer. She knew a good one and wanted the best chance for Morgan. But lawyers didn't come cheap, nor did they work for free. Chewing her bottom lip, she wondered how on earth they would pay for a lawyer when they could barely raise the money to pay the taxes on their home. Her stomach felt like lead as she drove toward town on autopilot. Her mind was so busy trying to work a solution that she barely noticed how crowded the roads were getting now that tourist season had started, or how all the shops were now opening for the season, or Mrs. Penobscot setting up for her perpetual weekend yard sale that she stocked with random items she found in the attic of her old family home. Suddenly, Fiona had an idea of how she could get the money to hire a lawyer for Morgan. She pressed harder on the gas and headed toward home.
So right now we got on the speeding ticket.
Chapter 3. The springs on Jake's ancient police-issue chair protested loudly as he leaned back and put his feet on the desk. He knew the woman in the holding cell was no murderer. He had a gut instinct about these things, and he was usually right. Of course, getting Sheriff Overton to see it his way was another story. It was curious, though, that Overton had been so adamant about arresting her, even though any fool could see the evidence was circumstantial at best. But then, Overton rarely did things that made sense to Jake. Jake ran his hand over the stubble on his chin. He hated to admit it, but he just didn't get a warm feeling about his new boss. Something was strange about him. Jake often found him difficult to work with. Overton was the type of guy that was never wrong, and some of the things he did made Jake wonder which side of the law he was on. But Jake was the new guy, a peon, so he just nodded and did his job. Of course, he wouldn't just stand by and let Overton prosecute someone without the proper evidence, but hopefully it wouldn't come to that. Surely, the various lawyers and judges involved would laugh in Overton's face if he tried to get a trial on the evidence he had, which made Jake wonder just what the sheriff was up to with this arrest. He'd almost refused to handcuff Morgan, but something told him it would be better if he played along. Still, he'd felt bad snapping those metal shackles on her slender wrist. At least he'd made sure they were loose. She probably could have wriggled out of them if she tried.
She didn't.
But she didn't. Jake smiled, thinking of the red-headed sister, and how fiercely she had tried to defend Morgan. She sure was a feisty one. Whereas the dark-haired girl was more calm, serene almost. The two were so different. You'd never know they were sisters, except they both had those piercing ice blue eyes. Jake had always been a sucker for redheads, but he had no intention of getting caught up in any kind of relationship. Especially not in a small town like Noquit, where everybody knew everybody else's business.
Okay, I'm gonna be back in a second. Hold on. Give me a momento. Oh, I'll just vacuum it out. Well, whatever. I have so much powder on me, it doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter! It really doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter. I tried so hard to come so far, but in the end, it doesn't even matter. Another thing of fudge the Papa gave me. Where is it? Where's the fudge? What the fudge? Oh, it's chocolate fudge. Did you not know? No, it's probably really good. The pink chocolate flavor was so good. Maybe it's in here. I don't know. I put random shit in random places. Nope. Okay. Ooh, popcorn. I had popcorn. Well, it'll work for now.
Besides, he'd had enough of relationships to last him a lifetime in Boston. Probably better off to avoid the Blackmore sisters, and maybe even the whole case. Still, he felt bad for the woman sitting in the jail cell in the basement of the police station. She didn't have any prior arrest record, so she was probably terrified. Not to mention, she was most likely there under false pretenses. Jake couldn't do anything about that, but he could do something to make her stay a little less harrowing. He slid his feet off the desk, slapping them down on the floor, and picked up his phone to dial in some takeout. The least he could do was get her something decent to eat, besides the slop they'd give her down there. He placed the order for a pot roast dinner to be delivered at 5. He planned to take it down to her himself for dinner, convincing himself he was just doing a good deed to try to make up for his role in her arrest, and it had nothing to do with the fact that her sister would be back just around supper time. Chapter 4. Fiona's heart thumped in her chest. She stared at the old door that led to the attic. Reaching for the glass knob, she turned it slowly. The squeaking of the hinges echoed loudly in the stairwell, setting her nerves on edge. The stairs loomed in front of her, stretching up into the darkness of the 4th floor. Fumbling for a light switch, she took a deep breath. It was silly to be afraid of the attic. After all, it was just a big room. Well, more than a room, as it comprised the whole 4th floor of the mansion her and her sisters lived in. But she had been warned since childhood by her mother and grandmother to stay away from there. And the place still scared her, even if she was all grown up now. Of course, Fiona and her sisters had ignored the warning on several occasions, but every time she had gone in there, she'd felt creeped out and never stayed long. Today, she had to go in. Morgan's freedom depended on it. Ascending the stairs cautiously, she cringed as the old dry wood creaked and groaned, as if protesting her presence. The temperature rose a notch with each step she took, and she felt thankful it was mid-spring and not summer, when the attic heat would be unbearable. She swiveled her head at the top of the stairs, trying to decide where to start. The attic, which had been servants' quarters hundreds of years ago, held a maze of rooms and cubbyholes, which were packed with the cast-offs of her ancestors. 275 years of household and personal belongings gathered dust up here. Did her people never throw anything away? Breathing in the smell of old wood, she started picking out a path toward the back of the house. Sunlight filtered in through the windows, highlighting the dust motes hanging in the still, dry air. She wasn't sure exactly what she was looking for. Something they could sell, pawn, or trade to raise the money for a lawyer. Even though they had made a pact to never sell any of their family heirlooms, Fiona felt certain her other sisters would agree to make the exception for Morgan. She turned her head from side to side, slowly navigating the attic. Her breath caught suddenly in her throat when she spied a human figure out of the corner of her eye. Then she released it just as quickly when she realized it was just an old dress form. Passing old trunks, rolled up rugs, closed up boxes, dinnerware, furniture, and even a kitchen sink, she realized she'd never really looked at any of the stuff in the attic, and slowly became mesmerized with the task. Crash! Fiona's heart exploded in her chest, and she whirled around toward the direction of the noise, her fists tight at her side. Her eyes searched rapidly for some sort of weapon. Her mind raced. Who would be up in the attic with her? Meow. Fiona let her breath out sharply. Her shoulders relaxed. Belladonna, you scared the heck out of me. She bent to pick up the cream and white cat. What are you doing up here? She asked, stroking her fur. Belladonna answered with a purr. Probably hunting for mice, Fiona mused. Setting the cat down, she noticed what had made the noise. A heavy book lay on the floor, a century of dust floating in the air around it. Belladonna must have knocked the book off. Fiona went over and picked the book off the floor, taking care not to crack the leather binding. Setting it gently on a nearby table, she stared at the pages. They looked ancient, like parchment. The ink on them faded to almost nothing. Carefully, she turned a page, hoping her touch didn't cause the fragile paper to disintegrate. The book looked like some sort of journal. The ink clearly from a quill pen, the words barely legible. Could this be one of her ancestors' sailing journals? According to family legend, the main part of their home had been built in the early 1700s by a merchant who sailed the world. The house itself sat on a large cliff, with the ocean on 2 sides and the entrance to Perkins Cove on the 3rd. A perfect location for a sailing man. The house had been added to over the centuries, finally becoming a massive Victorian mansion. But the main part of the house still was within the structure, and she'd heard her mother and grandmother talk about old journals from the original builder of the house. She frowned down at the old book. She couldn't make out any dates, and it seemed a book that old would have been further toward the back. Tiny pinpricks on her leg interrupted her thoughts. She looked down to see Belladonna scratching at her. Right, I'm up here to look for something to help Morgan, not read some old journals. Thanks for reminding me. She carefully closed the book and put it back in its place in the bookshelf, mentally cataloging the location so she could revisit it later when she had more time. Apparently satisfied, Belladonna wound her way around Fiona's leg and scampered off with a tiny mew. Fiona started to continue her search, but was interrupted by a series of meows. Had Belladonna gotten stuck somewhere? Was she hurt? Her meows certainly sounded pitiful to Fiona's ears. Following the sound, she came to a small cutout in the eaves. The area was well lit by a large window, through which she could see the dark blue ocean. An old rocking chair sat under the window, and Fiona felt relieved to see Belladonna was unharmed. The small cat crouched on the floor in front of the chair, batting around a shiny object. What do you have there? Meow. Belladonna cast her ice blue eyes up at Fiona before returning her attention to the shiny object, which she batted in Fiona's direction. Fiona bent to pick it up, watching it sparkle in the light. Spreading it out in her hand, she realized it was a necklace. She recognized the style as being popular in the mid-1800s, probably one of her great-great-great-grandmother's pieces that had been stored up here after her death. Fiona could tell it was well made. This was no junky piece of costume jewelry, which was odd because she was under the impression that nothing of real value was up here. Her mother had always said it was just a bunch of old, broken junk the family was too miserly to throw away. But where did it come from? She looked around the floor for a jewelry box or some sort of container it might have been in, but saw nothing. The glitter of light from the window, reflecting off the stones in the necklace, caught her eye, and she moved closer to the window to look at it in the light. Squinting, she held the necklace up to the glass, looking for the telltale signs that the stones were worthless paste or glass. Why hadn't she thought to bring a jeweler's loupe? Her training as a gemologist had given her a keen eye, and the knowledge to be able to tell a gemstone from a fake. Naturally, tools helped her validate her assessment, but with a naked eye, it appeared this necklace was the real deal. Diamonds, emeralds, and gold. Fiona's heart flipped in her chest, and she felt like a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. If the necklace tested to be real, it would be worth much more than what she needed to secure a lawyer for Morgan. Clutching the jewelry in her hand, she turned and ran toward the stairs. She knew exactly what to do with the necklace to get the money they needed, without having to sell off a potentially important family heirloom. She just hoped her sisters were home, so she could discuss her plan with them and get their approval in time to put the wheels in motion before it was too late to save Morgan from spending the night in jail. Chapter 5. The back stairs dumped Fiona out into the black and white tiled kitchen, where Belladonna stood at her food bowl, munching away. Fiona frowned at the cat, wondering how she had beat her to the kitchen without passing her on the stairs, as she raced over to the pantry to get her test kit. There you are. Celeste appeared in the doorway, and Fiona noticed the worry on her face. I heard about Morgan in town, so I put Diana in charge of the yoga studio and came right home. I yelled all over the house for you, but you didn't answer. Where were you? Fiona turned, holding up the necklace. In the attic. Celeste looked at the ceiling. You went up there alone? It was the only way I could think of to find something we could use to secure a lawyer for Morgan. It's not so bad up there, really. Fiona shrugged. Fiona took her test kit and the necklace back into the kitchen and set them on the large island in the center. The spacious kitchen had been built sometime in the mid-1800s and still had the original dark cabinets offset by white marble counters. Stainless steel appliances were a newer addition, as was the island, which had a sink in the center. It had chairs set up on one side, and the sisters spent many hours there, chatting and eating. So, what happened with Morgan? Celeste plopped herself down cross-legged in the chair on the other side of the island. She ran her hand nervously through her short, white, blonde hair, while Fiona recounted the morning's events. She's still in jail? Can they even do that without concrete evidence? Celeste's ice-blue eyes narrowed, and she worried her bottom lip. I don't know if they can, but they have. Sheriff Overton doesn't seem to like us much. Tell me about it, Celeste said, making a face. But the new guy, Jake, I think his name is, seems kind of nice. Fiona felt her stomach do a little flip at the mention of Jake. What was that all about?
Oh?
She ignored it and started cleaning off a section of the necklace, then clipped the alligator clip from her gold tester to it. So, what's up with the necklace? Celeste asked. We need to get Morgan a lawyer, but since we have no money, I thought maybe we could find something in the attic we could sell. Fiona let her voice trail off and looked up to judge Celeste's reaction. But her sister retained her usual calm demeanor. It sure is pretty, Celeste said, leaning over the island to get a better look. I wonder which one of our relatives it belonged to. Fiona didn't have an answer, so she turned the gold tester on and filled the well with testing acid, then dipped the section of necklace in. Both sisters held their breath while they waited for the machine to tell them if it was real gold or not. Fiona felt her heart skip a beat when the machine beeped and the light lit up. The necklace was 18-karat gold. Nice! Celeste raised her hand up, and Fiona slapped her palm in a high five. So, what's your plan? Fiona looked up from the task of packing up the test kit. I think I know how we can raise the money for Morgan's lawyer without actually having to sell the necklace, but I need you and Jolene to give it the thumbs up, she said. Where is our little sister? Celeste pushed her brows together. I haven't seen her. Fiona bit her lower lip. Her youngest sister, Jolene, had been a handful since their mother had jumped to her death from the cliff behind their house 4 years ago. The poor girl had only been 14. It had affected all the girls deeply, but Jolene was hurt the most at her young age. Fiona, Celeste, and Morgan had tried to raise her as best they could, but Celeste had only been 19 herself. Morgan and Fiona had been in their late 20s and had tried to share the role of mothering between them. Jolene had been a terror in her teenage years, which likely contributed to the dislike Sheriff Overton had for the whole family. But since she'd turned 18 a few months ago, Fiona had started to see a change in her. She guessed she was finally growing up. Still, it worried her that they didn't know where Jolene was. She was supposed to either be home or let one of them know where she was if she went out. As if summoned by magic, Jolene suddenly came sauntering in from the living room, head down, bopping to the music that blared so loudly from her earbuds that Fiona could hear it on the other side of the room. Fiona felt a nudge of annoyance when the girl didn't even look up at either of them. Jolene, she said, but the girl continued on her path to the pantry without even stopping. Jolene! Fiona yelled, eliciting a startled look from the teen, who swiveled her head in Fiona's direction, then reached up to pull out an earbud. Oh, hi. Sorry, didn't see you there. Jolene shrugged in apology, then shifted her gaze between her two sisters. What's up? It's about Morgan. Fiona saw Jolene's eyes grow wide. The ice blue color looked startling against her pale face and chocolate brown hair. Fiona marveled at how all four of the sisters had the same color eyes, a family trait shared by many Blackmore women, but all had different hair and coloring.
All except their mom.
What? Did something happen to her?
I think. I don't know.
Jolene swiveled her head between the two sisters. Sort of, Fiona said. Then she repeated the story of Morgan's arrest, while Jolene listened intently, her frown growing deeper and deeper. They're keeping her in jail? That Overton is really a jerk. Normally, Fiona would have told her not to say bad things about others, but this time, she couldn't really argue. He was a jerk. Don't worry. We're getting her out this afternoon. I want to hire Delphine Jones to represent Morgan, but she needs a $5,000 retainer just to take the case. Celeste gasped. Where are we going to get $5,000? That's where this comes in. Fiona held the necklace up, dangling it from her fingers. Jolene raised her eyebrows. Where'd you get that? In the attic. Fiona saw Jolene shudder. Mom always told me the most horrid ghost stories of the attic. I was always afraid to go up there. Fiona felt her heart ache at the mention of her mother. Tears pricked the backs of her eyes as she remembered the colorful stories of their ancestors, including tales of pirates, witches, and ghostly hauntings that their mother had loved to tell. Fiona knew they were all mostly made up, but as a child, she had listened to each one with rapt attention. So, you want to sell it? Celeste interrupted her thoughts. No, not sell it. Pawn it, Fiona said. We can take it down to Cal Reed and see if he'll take it in exchange for the money we need. We know the charges against Morgan will never stick. She didn't do it. So we won't need to spend the whole $5,000 with Delphine. Once Morgan is cleared, we can get the rest of our deposit back, scrape up whatever we need to top it off to $5,000, and collect the necklace from Cal. That's a great idea. We know we can trust Cal, Celeste said. Calvin Reed had been a classmate of Fiona's and good friends with all the Blackmore girls since they were kids. He was practically like a brother to them. Fiona had no doubt he would take good care of their necklace in his pawn shop. It was the best way she could think of to raise the money and still have a chance of keeping the necklace in the family. So, are we in agreement to do this? Fiona asked. Yes. Of course. Great. Fiona put her fisted hand out toward the other girls, her knuckles facing them, and the three did a knuckle tap. If you need to come up with more money, I have a little socked away from my job, Jolene said. Having recently graduated, she'd taken a job at one of the local restaurants, Barnacle Bill's, until she decided what she wanted to do with her life. Fiona felt her heart melt at the offer. A year ago, it seemed like Jolene could have cared less what happened to any of them. She was distant and moody, spending most of her time in her room or arguing with them. But she really seemed to be coming around. Fiona wondered if this was how a parent felt when they realized their little child was finally growing up. Hopefully, it won't come to that, Fiona said. Now, let's get a move on. We still have to meet with Delphine and go over to Cal's. I don't want Morgan rotting in jail any longer than she has to. Chapter 6. I'm going to give Overton a piece of my mind,
Ooh.
sputtered Delphine Jones as she climbed out of her late-model Toyota. What he's doing is barely legal. Fiona leaned against Celeste's Volkswagen, which was parked next to Delphine's, and studied the petite attorney. She wore a casual outfit consisting of an ankle-length skirt in a rainbow of colors, an orange t-shirt, and a yellow blazer. Somehow, the outfit worked on her and complemented her dark skin and cropped hair. Fiona knew she had made the right decision in hiring Delphine, even though she was a bit unconventional. The attorney was a whirlwind of energy. She didn't waste any time, got things done quickly, and most importantly, she believed that Morgan was innocent. "Shall we?" Fiona nodded her head toward the police station, and Delphine started walking. Fiona, Celeste, and Jolene followed. "I'll go up and deal with Overton," Delphine said. "You can go visit your sister." Delphine looked at her watch. "She should be released within 15 minutes. After that, I gotta run. So I'll be back in touch with you if I hear anything new. It's really just a waiting game after this. Overton has to come up with something concrete that ties Morgan to the murder scene before he can start to prosecute. Right now, he's got nothing." Fiona opened the police station door and motioned for Delphine to go in. The feisty attorney stormed up to the desk. "I need to see Sheriff Overton, pronto," she barked at the desk clerk. The clerk, a short, round woman whose head barely reached the top of the counter, looked around nervously. "He's busy now." Delphine slapped her hand on the counter. "I don't care what he's doing. You tell him if he doesn't talk to me now, the next time he sees me, it will be on opposite sides of a wrongful arrest suit." The clerk's eyes went wide, and she got up from her chair. "Yes, ma'am." "And make sure somebody takes these girls down to see my client, Morgan Blackmore," Delphine yelled after her, leaning over the counter. Delphine turned and winked at Fiona as a uniformed officer came out from the back. "This way, ladies." He gestured for them to file through the door he held open. The girls were unusually silent as they followed the officer down a manila-tiled corridor to a steel door that opened to reveal a set of concrete stairs. They filed down the stairs, the echoes of their footsteps sounding hollow, the musty smell getting stronger with each step. Fiona's heart lurched in her chest, thinking of poor Morgan in her barren, uncomfortable jail cell, enduring this pungent mildew smell, and God only knew what else. They trudged down a long corridor, toward a door made of metal bars, which the officer pressed a button on the wall to open. He held it for the three girls. Fiona turned, and her heart skipped when she noticed the looks on her sisters' faces mirrored her own apprehensive feelings. The room had 3 cells. The officer stopped in front of the last one, and Fiona willed her feet to follow him. An iron fist squeezed her chest. She could barely breathe, picturing what she would see when she looked in the cell. Morgan, depressed and crying, curled on the cot, all alone. Then she heard a trill of laughter. Morgan's laughter. Her brow furrowed, and she increased her pace. "You have visitors, Morgan," the officer said into the cell, and then stepped back to make room for Fiona, Celeste, and Jolene to crowd around the front. Fiona's mouth dropped open when she saw what was really going on in the cell. Morgan sat on the small bed. Across from her in a chair sat Jake Cooper. A folding table in between them held what looked like the remnants of a pot roast meal, complete with mashed potatoes and vegetables. Morgan's face broke into a smile when she saw her sisters. "Hey, you guys didn't have to all come down here." She got up and walked over to the bars. "Morgan, what are you doing?" Fiona's eyes narrowed, and she tilted her head toward the table of food and Jake. Morgan looked back over her shoulder. "Oh, Jake just brought me supper. Wasn't that nice of him?" Fiona screwed up her face and scrutinized Jake as Morgan greeted her other sisters. What was he up to? "I hope you didn't tell him anything," Fiona whispered to Morgan. "Like what?" Morgan shrugged. "I don't have anything to tell." In the background, Fiona could see Jake picking up what was left of their dinner. He stood and came toward them. "Are these your sisters?" he asked. "Yep, this is Celeste, Jolene, and you already know Fiona, I think." Jake nodded to Fiona and shook hands with the others. "Well, I think we can open the door and let them in to visit," he said, nodding to the officer still standing behind them. The door slid open, and the girls rushed in to hug Morgan, while Jake stepped out of the cell. Just then, another officer appeared. "Overton says to release her," he said to Jake. "Well, looks like you're free to go." Jake nodded at Morgan, then stepped back to let the women precede him up the corridor. "I can go?" "You mean I'm cleared?" Morgan asked. "No, you're still a suspect," the officer answered. "We just don't have enough to hold you." "Oh." Morgan's face fell a little, but then she smiled. "Well, I know I'll be cleared soon enough, so it's just as good." They filed out, Morgan first, and Fiona bringing up the rear. Jake stepped in line behind them. They retraced their steps up the corridor, up the steps, then stopped at the desk to collect an envelope of Morgan's personal effects. Fiona felt her heart swell at the look of joy on Morgan's face as they headed out the door that Jake held open for them. She cleared the doorway, and Jake fell in behind her. She ignored the flip-flop of her stomach when he put his hand on the small of her back,
Oh?
attributing it to all the excitement and lack of dinner. "Now, I expect you girls won't do anything silly," he said, looking pointedly at Fiona.
Mm-hmm.
She crossed her arms over her chest. "Like what?" "Oh, you know, go poking around trying to figure out who the killer is." Fiona felt anger rising. Who was he to tell them what to do?
A good officer.
"Well, since the police seem hell-bent on prosecuting my sister for it, I don't see we have much choice." Jake looked down at the pavement and pushed a pebble around with his shoe. When he looked back up, Fiona's heart lurched at something she saw in his eyes. Concern? Fear? She wasn't sure which, but his next words chilled her. "Look, I think we might be dealing with someone very dangerous here. You girls should stay out of it. Let the police handle it." Fiona snickered, but Morgan cut her off before she could say anything. "Of course we will. Won't we, Fee?" Fiona noticed the way Morgan raised her eyebrow at her and took that as a warning to keep quiet. "Sure." She managed to choke the words out. "Good. Then I'll wish you good luck and send you on your way." He nodded at them, turned, and strode back into the police station. Fiona stared at his retreating back. She had no intention of following his orders, especially when it seemed like the police were content to pin the murder on Morgan. She didn't feel confident that they would conduct a thorough investigation to find the real killer. For all she knew, the dangerous person she needed to be afraid of was Jake Cooper himself. Chapter 7. Morgan curled her feet under her in the oversized chair and took a sip of chamomile tea. Reaching down, she stroked the silky fur of Belladonna, who lay on her lap contentedly purring. It felt good to be home. Morgan felt safe here, in her favorite room with her sisters. It wasn't the largest one in their 24-room home, but it was the most comfortable. Decorated in grays and blues, Morgan could see her mother's touch everywhere, from the overstuffed white furniture, to the giant starfish and seashells on the mantel, to the chipped paint coffee table. The room sat on the east side of the house, and the large bay window offered an unobstructed view of the Atlantic Ocean a mere 200 feet away. "I feel awful that you guys had to pawn that necklace. I didn't even know there was stuff like that up there," Morgan said, glancing upwards toward the attic. "We didn't have much choice. It didn't look like they were going to let you out," Fiona said. "Unless you were planning on charming Jake Cooper into springing you." Morgan laughed. Hardly. Then she narrowed her eyes at Fiona. He's not the enemy, you know? Fiona snorted. Huh. He's the one that cuffed you and put you in the back of the police car. Only because he was ordered to. Fiona glared at Morgan. Think what you want, but I'm warning you, you'd better watch out around him. I sense that he's trouble. Morgan cocked an eyebrow at her sister, wondering why Fiona was protesting so much about Jake. She didn't think Jake was trouble. She thought Jake could be a valuable ally, and he seemed like a perfect match for Fiona. Morgan could practically see the sparks fly between them. She was certain Jake felt the same way. She'd noticed how his gaze lingered on Fiona at the jail. If only Fiona would just wake up and notice it herself. Maybe she would have to give her a special herbal tea to help things along. I didn't want to take the necklace, Cal said, coming in from the kitchen with 2 glasses full of green juice. I could just lend you guys the money. Morgan watched Cal hand Celeste one of the glasses, and then sit next to her on the couch. He'd been sitting on their front porch when they returned home, worried about her. Aww. Cal was the closest thing they had to a brother, and she would never risk their relationship by borrowing money from him. Don't be silly. We would never take advantage of you like that, Fiona said, echoing Morgan's thoughts. Cal made a face. Oh, for crying out loud. I have the money. Besides, that necklace is a family heirloom, and a nice one at that. You girls should really get up in the attic and see what else is there. What kind of stuff was up there, Fee? Morgan asked. Just a bunch of old junk, furniture, dishes, boxes packed full of God knows what. Fiona furrowed her brow. There was one interesting thing, though. Celeste and Cal both raised their eyebrows. What? They said at the same time, then fell back on the couch, laughing, and punched each other lightly in the arm. It was an old book. It looked ancient, but I couldn't find any date. A handwritten journal of some sort. What did it say? I don't know. I couldn't make out the writing, and I didn't have much time to study it. Maybe we should go up there and look around, Morgan said. Belladonna let out a loud meow and hopped down from her lap. Morgan watched her walk toward the kitchen, tail swishing high in the air. Just as the cat reached the kitchen doorway, she turned and looked right at Morgan as if to say, Come on, what are you waiting for? Morgan laughed to herself at her own overactive imagination. The cat wasn't trying to communicate with her. That was ridiculous, wasn't it? Jolene's eyes went wide. I don't think we should. Mom told us not to. Mom didn't know we'd be scrambling to come up with tax money, or trying to avoid getting charged with murder. Cal leaned back on the couch, stretching out his long legs. Well, it's up to you guys, but if you need my help in figuring out what anything is worth, let me know. Morgan studied Cal from the other side of the room. She knew his intent was honest. He really did want to help, and he did have a lot of knowledge about antiques, since he'd been running his family pawn shop for almost a decade. She knew they could trust him, and she filed the information away for later, in case they got desperate for money. Cal was about the nicest guy she knew. Tall, dark, and handsome, he was also the most eligible bachelor in town. It was rumored that women pawned jewelry at his shop just to talk to him, hoping for a date. Morgan didn't know how true that was, but he sure would be a good catch for the right woman. Morgan herself might have been interested, but there was only one man she would ever love, and he'd left town, and her, years ago. Okay, so what do we do now? Celeste interrupted Morgan's thoughts. About what? Jolene asked. We have to do something to help prove Morgan didn't kill Prudence Littlefield. I don't know how much we really need to do. Don't you guys think the police will find the real killer? Morgan asked. Fiona waved her hand in the air. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not going to sit back while the police bumble their way through an investigation. There's a killer out there, and I don't care what Jake Copper says. I'm going to find out who it is. She glanced around the room, piercing each of them with her steely blue gaze. Now, who's with me? Chapter 8. Fiona woke the next morning in a tangle of sheets. The questions running around in her head had kept her awake all night. Who could have killed Prudence? Why? What should they do to find the killer? She swung her legs over the bed and looked out the window. Squinting, she brought her hand up to shade her eyes from the glare of the morning sun reflecting off the water. It was just shortly after sunrise, and looked like it was going to be a beautiful day. But somehow, Fiona wasn't enthusiastic about getting out of bed. Coffee. She needed coffee. She stood up and stretched, wincing at the cracking sound coming from her back. Throwing a sweatshirt on over the t-shirt and sweatpants she wore to bed, she wrapped her long red curls in a ponytail and headed down to the kitchen. The front stairs creaked as she walked down them, echoing eerily throughout the silent house. Was everyone else still asleep? They had stayed up late the night before, hashing out a plan of action. Whoever had killed Prudence must have been in the coffee shop when she had her run-in with Morgan, or at least heard about it from someone who was there. Fiona and Morgan would try to find out who was in the coffee shop that morning. Celeste's job was to find out if any of her customers at the yoga center knew anything, and Cal was going to ask some of his seedier clients at the pawn shop what they knew about it. Fiona didn't want Jolene getting involved, but Jolene had insisted on asking around to see if any of her friends had heard anything about the murder. Fiona padded into the kitchen, feeling the cold of the granite tile on her bare feet. She made her way to the coffee maker and popped in a K-cup. She really needed a large latte to get her going, but this would have to do until she could make it to the coffee shop. Meow! Belladonna jabbed at her calf, the needle-like claws raking her flesh. Ouch! Cut that out! Fiona swatted at the cat with her foot. Belladonna responded by trotting over to the kitchen door and scratching at it. Meow! Oh, you want me to let you out? Why didn't you just say so? Fiona took her cup of steaming coffee and walked over to the door. Peeking out the window, she could see the sunlight hitting the tiny plants in Morgan's herb garden. She opened the door, and Belladonna streaked out into the garden. Fiona followed, relishing the feel of the dew-soaked grass on her bare feet, even if it was a little cold. She turned her face to the sun and closed her eyes, inhaling the bitter aroma of the coffee. Meow! Fiona opened her eyes and looked toward the cat, who was scratching at the ground. Belladonna, stop that. Morgan will be mad if you dig up her plants. Belladonna didn't stop. She dug even more furiously at the ground. Fiona's brows knit together as she watched the cat. She was digging in an isolated part of the garden, one Morgan hadn't planted in yet. I hope you aren't digging up a dead mouse. Fiona walked over. Looking down at the patch of dirt Belladonna was working on, she saw something strange. She bent down for a closer look. What's this? She tugged at the bright orange fabric. Her heart froze when she recognized the sunflower scarf in her hands. Prudence Littlefield's scarf, the one she was wearing the day she was murdered. Fiona couldn't help but wonder, what was it doing in Morgan's garden? Chapter 9. If you ask me, It was Berta Crum who done it. Fiona narrowed her eyes at Agatha Beasley, who stood on the other side of her jewelry case, trying a carnelian bracelet on her wrist. What do you mean? Well, Berta and Prudence had a long-going feud, she said, twisting her ample wrist to study the bracelet from different angles. Who didn't Prudence have a feud with? Agatha glanced around the shop, then leaned in toward Fiona, lowering her voice. Prudence stole Ed away from Berta, you know? Fiona made a face. Picturing a love triangle between Prudence, Ed, and Berta, even in their younger days, was too much. She gulped down the rest of her latte, wishing the cup held something stronger. So, you think Berta might have killed Prudence because she stole Ed from her 50-some-odd years ago? It hardly seems likely she would have waited that long. Agatha nodded, returning her attention to the bracelet. They've had quite a few fights about it over the years. Maybe the opportunity just presented itself. Fiona looked across the shop at Morgan, who was busy preparing a salve of ground-up jewelweed to help someone with a bad case of poison ivy. She'd arrived late at the shop after getting their tea and coffee from the cafe and hadn't told Morgan about the scarf yet. Her stomach churned just thinking about it. She was afraid of what Morgan might say about the scarf being buried in the garden. Did she bury it there? And if so, why? I'll take this and those matching earrings. Agatha interrupted her thoughts. Fiona packaged up the jewelry and rang up the sale, thanking Agatha for her purchase and her information. The bell over the door announced Agatha's departure, and Morgan looked up, meeting Fiona's eyes. We should at least talk to Berta, she said. Fiona nodded, and figure out anyone else who might have wanted her dead. She was mean to almost everyone. Maybe there are other people who would have wanted to kill her. Maybe she ran into someone in the woods, was her usual nasty self, and they killed her in a fit of anger. We should probably talk to her husband, too, Fiona said. The spouse is the first person they usually question in the movies. And we need to come up with a list of everyone who witnessed your conversation in the cafe that morning. Morgan sighed. Geez, almost half the town was there. She closed her eyes and chewed on her bottom lip. I remember seeing Elle from the bakery, Katie Morgan, Sandy Shawnee, Eli Stark. Her voice trailed off. It's no use. We could never talk to all these people. How will we narrow it down? Fiona felt her stomach sinking. Morgan was right. Too many people had been in the cafe. Not to mention that word had probably spread all around town about their altercation. Anyone could have known what Morgan had said to Prudence that day. They sat in silence, each of them wrestling with their own thoughts. The grandfather clock, passed down by some distant relative, tick-tocked off the seconds, measuring the passage of time. Time. That's it! Fiona snapped her fingers. Morgan raised her eyebrows. What? Maybe instead of trying to prove who did do it, we can prove that you couldn't have done it. Fiona held her breath, waiting to see Morgan's reaction. She did feel sure her sister couldn't have killed Prudence, despite the incriminating scarf in her garden. Didn't she? How would we do that? Morgan narrowed her eyes, tilting her head to one side. Easy. You came here straight after you left the coffee shop, right? Morgan nodded. Then all we need to do is establish a timeline and prove that you didn't have time to kill Prudence. But we don't even know exactly what time she was killed. Maybe we can get that information from Jake. Fiona ignored the mischievous glint in Morgan's eyes and pursed her lips. No, we can't trust him. But we can trust Delphine. I'll see if I can get the time of death from her. But we do know she was strangled in the woods in between the coffee shop and her house, which is only about 1/4 mile from here. How fast can you run a 1/4 mile? Run? You know I never run, Morgan laughed. Well, if you just strangled someone, you might be running. Morgan shrugged. I don't know, 5 minutes, maybe? But you'd have to go out of your way to get to the woods. We need to find out exactly where Prudence was killed. Visit the scene of the crime, so to speak. Then we can figure out how long it would take you to go from the cafe to the scene, strangle her, and then come here. How long do you think it takes to strangle someone? Morgan asked. I have no idea. But if we can prove that you wouldn't have had time, they'll have to drop the charges. Yes, but I still don't see how we can prove it. Well, I remember looking at my watch when you came in because I was dying for my latte. It was just after 8:10. Maybe someone who was in the coffee shop will remember what time you left? Morgan looked at her dubiously. Do you really think so? Fiona sighed. It was a long shot. They needed something more concrete. Wait a minute. Did you get a receipt? Probably. I usually just stuff them in my jeans and then take them out and toss them on laundry day. Morgan's face brightened. Hey, it might still be in here. Fiona watched Morgan dig in her pockets, a cloud passing over her face as she came up empty. I was wearing these yesterday. They took everything out of the pockets of the jail, so if I have one, it must be in the envelope they gave me. We'll look for that tonight. It might be a great way to prove you're innocent. If the police will believe me when I tell them what time you got here... Morgan nodded. Yeah, seems like Overton might not go for that. But it's worth a try. Okay, well, anyway, back to... Fiona was interrupted by the trilling of her cell phone on the workbench behind her. She turned to look at the display, and her heart lurched. Jolene. She never called her at work unless something was wrong. She dived for the phone. Hello? Fiona, it's Jolene. You guys better get home quick. The police are here, and they're digging up the yard. Chapter 10. Skidding her truck to a stop at the edge of the driveway, Fiona jumped out, her heart pounding in her chest as she ran to the garden on the east side of the house. Her body tensed with anger when she saw what was going on. Sheriff Overton stood watch over Jake Cooper and another officer while they turned the earth over with shovels. She noticed they were in the exact area where she had found the scarf. How did they know exactly where to look? Jolene stood off to the side, her eyes wide. Morgan ran to her and put a comforting arm around her. Fiona stood frozen, staring at the men, trying to get her mouth to work, when the screech of tires in the driveway caught her attention. She turned her head in time to see Delphine running toward Overton, flapping her arms. Just what do you think you are doing? She demanded. Fiona felt her stomach roil with anger at the smug look on Overton's face. He stared Delphine down, his tongue switching the toothpick from side to side. We got an anonymous tip that someone saw your client bury a crucial piece of evidence here. What are you talking about? Delphine turned to Morgan. Do you know anything about this? Morgan shook her head. Fiona noticed the perplexed look on Morgan's face. Either she'd taken acting lessons, or she really did know nothing about the scarf. Let me see the warrant. Delphine stuck her hand out toward Overton. Listen, Missy, I don't need a warrant. I got a tip. You most certainly do need one, Delphine countered, and I suggest you either produce one or get off my client's property, unless you want a lawsuit. And don't call me Missy. Fiona noticed Jake carefully putting the dirt back, taking care not to disturb Morgan's tender seedlings. He looked up, and she felt a jolt go through her when their eyes met. Overton looked down at Delphine, then glared over at Morgan. "If we have to take time to get a warrant, that will give your client a chance to move the evidence." "Well, you should have thought of that before and gone through the proper channels," Delphine spit back at him. "Now, move it." Overton nodded to Jake and the other officer, who was leaning on his shovel, listening to the exchange. "Let's pack it up, boys. We'll come back later. I know the evidence is here." He stared at Morgan as he said the words, then started off toward the front of the house. Fiona shrank back when he brushed past her. Delphine turned to Fiona. "Do you know what he's talking about?" Fiona's stomach flipped. Should she tell her? Her first instinct was to keep quiet. If she let Delphine know she'd found the scarf, she'd probably make her give it up to the police, and Fiona had a sneaking suspicion the police were planning to use that scarf to incriminate Morgan. "No idea," she said, mentally crossing her fingers. "Let me know if he comes here again without a warrant." "Okay. Thanks for getting here so fast." Fiona had called the lawyer as soon as she'd hung up with Jolene. Delphine must have had to break some speeding records to get there when she did. "All in a day's work," Delphine said, nodding to Fiona, then turning and trotting off toward her car. Fiona could see Jolene, almost in tears, over by the house. "I didn't know the right thing to do," she was saying to Morgan. "You called us right away. That was the right thing," Morgan assured her, then ushered her into the house by the kitchen door. Fiona started over toward the door herself, noticing that Jake was still in the garden, apparently trying to put it back the way he found it. She stomped over, wanting him off the property, along with the other members of the police. "You can go now, too. We'll take care of this." She stood with her hands on her hips. Jake glanced around, then leaned toward her. "Listen, I think something funny is going on. This tip, it just didn't seem right." Fiona stepped back, narrowing her eyes. Was this some sort of trick? "What do you mean?" "There's a certain procedure, but this one, it just seemed to come out of thin air." He had stepped even closer now, so that he towered over her. She could smell the spicy scent of his aftershave. His gray eyes mesmerized her, and she stepped closer. He put his hand on her arm, causing a cascade of tingles to flutter in her lower belly. He leaned closer toward her. "You'd better warn Morgan to be on her guard. Something isn't right here." Fiona blinked at his warning. Then he let her arm go abruptly, turned, and walked toward the front of the house. She stared after him, noticing how his backside filled out his uniform just perfectly. Then she shook herself. What was she thinking? Even though Jake's warning seemed sincere, she still didn't think she could trust him. His concern for Morgan made her feel a little funny. If she didn't know better, she'd swear it was jealousy. Laughing at herself, she turned toward the kitchen door. That was ridiculous. She didn't give two figs about Jake Cooper. Why would she feel jealous if he had the hots for Morgan? Chapter 11. Fiona came in the kitchen door, just as Celeste came in the front door. "We're in here," Morgan called out into the front hallway. Celeste came rushing in, her face flushed. "What happened? I heard the police were here." Morgan got up to make tea, while Fiona told Celeste about the police digging in the garden. She paced the room, hands flying in the air, anger rising inside her as she relayed the events. When she was done, Morgan handed her a cup of tea. "What's this? I don't drink that stuff. I drink coffee." Fiona pushed the cup away. "Right now, you need something calming, not caffeine to ramp you up more. Just sit and drink it." Morgan pushed the cup into her hands, and pulled out a chair, which Fiona obediently sat in. She took a sip and almost spit it out. Blech! This tastes like grass. What's in here? Oh, a little chamomile and some other herbs to relax you. Drink, Morgan commanded, leaning against...
Oh! Well, I'm sorry, but what? Interesting. Okay, this is getting interesting. Okay, so I don't think you guys heard of the book earlier, but Morgan was contemplating putting in herbs that make her realize how much she likes Jake. Oh, and I think that's what she just did. Okay, this is gonna get interesting. Okay, I'm gonna shut up so you can listen to the audio.
The kitchen counter on the other side of the bar. Fiona wrinkled her nose, but took another sip. Okay, maybe it wasn't so bad. And she did feel calmer already. I don't think I understand. What did they think was in the garden? Celeste asked. I'm not sure. Some sort of evidence, Morgan answered. Fee, do you know what that was all about? Fiona's heart tightened in her chest. She had to come clean with her sisters. Well, actually I do, she said. Setting down her cup, she looked at Morgan, her stomach fluttering. She hoped her sister wouldn't be mad that she didn't come to her right away. Well, Morgan lifted her shoulders. What is it? There was some evidence in the garden, except I found it before they did. Celeste gasped. What was it? Prudence Littlefield's scarf, the one she was wearing the day she was killed. Morgan, Celeste, and Jolene stared at her in silence. What are you talking about? Morgan asked. This morning, I was the first one up. Belladonna wanted to go out, so I let her out the door here, next to the garden. It was a beautiful morning, and I went out for a breath of fresh air. That's when I found the scarf. It was buried on the edge of the garden, near the tomato seedlings. Buried? Then how did you find it? Jolene asked. Well, it wasn't actually me who found it. It was Belladonna. She led me right to it. Everyone turned to look at Belladonna, who lay sleeping on the wide windowsill at the back of the kitchen. She turned her head toward them, opened one sleepy blue eye, then closed it and went back to sleep. She was digging in the garden and dug it right up, Fiona added. Morgan looked away from the cat, and Fiona flinched at the anger she saw in her sister's eyes. So, you had the scarf and didn't even tell me? We were at work together all morning and you never mentioned it. Why? Fiona's heart squeezed. She didn't want Morgan to know she had doubted her. I didn't really get a chance, she said, mostly telling the truth. There was someone in the shop when I got there with the coffee, and then Agatha came in, then we got involved in talking about how to find the killer, and then Jolene called. Morgan nodded, looking away. Where is it now? I hid it in my room, Fiona said, picturing the scarf tucked neatly in her secret hiding place, under a floorboard in the corner. Shouldn't we bring it to the police? Celeste asked. No! Fiona, Morgan, and Jolene all shouted at once. They'll probably just use it against Morgan, Fiona said. Someone clearly planted the scarf there. It could be someone with ties to the police. Or maybe it isn't, but one thing is clear. Someone is out to frame Morgan. Morgan sighed. Okay, well, since we are all here, let's use this time for something productive. Celeste, did you find anything out at the yoga studio? I talked to a few people that were in the coffee shop. Pretty much everyone thought it was funny, what you said to Prudence. Of course, no one thinks you killed her, but I didn't hear any clues or anything. I haven't talked to everyone in my circle yet, Jolene said, but I did see something strange on Facebook. Oh? What? Morgan asked. Josh Gray made some strange posts that made it look like he was going to invest in something expensive, which was odd, since he doesn't have any money. Fiona wrinkled her brow. What would that have to do with Prudence's murder? Probably nothing. Josh is the thug, and he brags a lot. He might just be blowing steam. Or maybe he did a big drug deal. Jolene shrugged. Probably nothing to do with the murder, but it was out of the ordinary. Has anyone talked to Cal? Fiona asked. I did, Morgan said. He hadn't heard anything. Fiona chewed the inside of her cheek. She didn't know where to start to try to figure out who the killer was. Then she remembered. They might not have to find the killer at all. Hey, what about the receipt from the coffee shop that morning? Did you look in the envelope? Morgan's eyebrows shot up. No, I forgot all about that. She spun around and grabbed the envelope from the counter behind her. Opening it, she dumped the contents on the island. All four girls leaned over to examine the pile. Chapstick, a $5 bill, some change, a couple of business cards, and her shoelaces. No receipt. It's not there, Morgan said, her face crumbling. Are you sure you even had one? Fiona asked. I usually just toss mine in the barrel. I'm pretty sure. Usually I just shove them in my pocket with the change, if I have to juggle 2 cups like I did that morning. But I can't be certain. The four girls bent down to examine the pile again, and then looked up at each other. Fiona noticed the grim look on Morgan's face as she said, If I did have that receipt, then someone at the police station took it. I have to admit, it really does look like someone is trying to frame me for killing Prudence. Celeste's brow knit together. It does seem that way, but why? I don't know, Morgan said. But these latest developments call for some drastic action. And I think I know just the person to help us.
Who?
Chapter 12. Jake stared at the Littlefield file on his desk. He'd been flipping through it for an hour, looking for inconsistencies, but nothing stuck out at him. Why was Overton so steamed about not finding that scarf? Back in Boston, Jake had followed up on his share of anonymous tips. Most of them turned out to be a dead end. Surely Overton knew this? It just didn't make sense that he would be so mad at not finding the supposed murder weapon. Unless he knew, without a reasonable doubt, that it would be there. And how could he know that? The only way Jake could figure he would know for sure was if it had been planted on his orders, or by someone he trusted explicitly. What he couldn't figure out was why. It didn't make any sense to frame Morgan for Prudence's death. He supposed it could just be convenient. Knowing about the argument they'd had in the coffee shop, the killer could have used the newt to cast suspicion on Morgan. Maybe they took the scarf for added insurance. But then, that begged the question, why would someone kill Prudence? Jake knew the logical thing would be to find out who stood to benefit from her murder. But Overton wasn't doing that. He seemed content to pin it on Morgan. Jake was sure there was something else going on, and he'd be willing to bet that Overton was right in the middle of it. He let out a sigh and snapped the file closed. All the file really told him was that Littlefield had been strangled, and the murder weapon, presumed to be this scarf Overton was so hot to dig up, was not found at the scene, which would lead one to believe the murderer had it. But why would the murderer take it? His thoughts turned to the Blackmore girls. He felt certain the redhead, Fiona, was going to be even more determined to find the real killer now. He could hardly blame her. His heart clenched when he thought of how alone the girls must feel. To them, it must seem like everyone is against them. But they wouldn't be alone, because Jake had already made up his mind to help find the real killer. And it had nothing to do with the silky way Fiona's skin felt under his hand, or the way he couldn't get the smell of her strawberry shampoo out of his mind. It was ingrained in him to find the truth, to serve justice. That was why he had become a cop. And he'd been a pretty good detective in Boston before the accident. Jake got up from his chair. He'd have to do his detecting in his spare time. If Overton caught on to his extracurricular activities, it could cost him his job, so he'd have to be very careful. But he knew just where to start. Overton had rushed them through the crime scene the day of the murder. At the time, he didn't think anything of it, but now he felt like he should go back over it with a fine-tooth comb. He was sure there must be a clue there that they had overlooked before. A clue that would, hopefully, lead them to the real killer. Chapter 13. Fiona pressed the doorbell, glancing over at Morgan. It was early afternoon, and the sun had heated the day to a pleasant 75 degrees. Fiona looked around the tidy porch, already dotted with flowering plants, and listened to the chirp of the birds. A sound at the door caught her attention, and she looked back in time to see Berta's face poke through the opening. "Oh, it's you girls," she said, swinging the door wide. "Do come in." Fiona stepped back and let Morgan enter first. "I put together some herbal teas for you," Morgan said, handing a small basket to Berta. Berta lifted the cloth that was on top and peered in. "Oh, wonderful. Let's go in the kitchen and I'll fix us some tea. I have ginger cookies fresh out of the oven." Fiona furrowed her brow. Ginger cookies? Killers didn't bake cookies and invite you in for tea, did they?
Do you want to look at
Fiona
it? Sure.
followed them into the tiny kitchen, which looked like something out of the 1950s. Yellow gingham curtains fluttered on either side of an open window. A small, round-cornered fridge sat at one end, and a tiny white stove sat next to it. Wooden cabinets painted a cheery yellow brightened the small room. The smell of ginger hung in the air. Berta motioned for them to sit at a yellow formica table, while she busied herself putting on the teapot and selecting some tea from the basket. Her selection made, she turned to Morgan. "I hope that nasty business with Prudence isn't affecting you too much, dear." Morgan shrugged. "Well, it is a little unsettling." Berta leaned in toward her. "Did you kill her?" she asked, with a gleam in her eye. Morgan gasped. Her eyebrows shot up. "What? No, I didn't kill her." Berta looked disappointed. "Oh, well, no one would blame you if you did. I might even thank you." "That's one reason why we are here. Do you know who might have wanted Prudence dead?" Fiona asked. Berta looked up at the ceiling. "There are so many people that hated her. But if I had to pick one person..." Fiona perched on the edge of her seat, waiting for the name, when Berta was interrupted by the whistle of the kettle. The older woman turned and grabbed it from the stove. Fiona noticed she grabbed it awkwardly with her left hand, while she kept her right hand next to her body. Morgan must have noticed, too, because she shot up out of her chair. "Let me help you with that. Did you hurt your arm?" "Thank you, dear." "Yes, I sprained my wrist," she said, wincing, and pulled her arm in closer as she handed Morgan the teapot. Fiona and Morgan glanced at each other. "When did that happen?" Fiona asked, taking a ginger cookie from the plate Berta had put on the table. Berta wrinkled her brow. "Oh, sometime last week," she said, absent-mindedly waving her good arm. Fiona took a bite of her cookie. The combination of sugar and spice tingled on her taste buds. "You were saying?" she prompted, hoping to get Berta to spill out the name of the one person she thought might have killed Prudence. Berta furrowed her brow. "What, dear?" Fiona sighed. "Before you poured the tea, you were saying if you had to pick one person who might have killed Prudence..." "Oh, right. Well, that would be Josiah Littlefield, of course, Ed's brother." Fiona raised an eyebrow over her steaming mug. "His brother?" "Yes, Josiah hated Prudence from the start. She was so controlling, demanding. He hated that she wouldn't let Ed do anything. And she controlled the money with an iron fist," Berta said. Then her forehead creased into a frown. "That's why it was so strange that her and Ed were fighting about selling their property to Eli Stark. She didn't want to sell, and he did. I would have thought she would have wanted the money." "They were fighting?" Morgan asked. "Yes, well, nothing unusual." Berta narrowed her eyes. "If you're thinking Ed might have killed her, I can assure you he did not. That man is gentle as a lamb. He wouldn't hurt a flea." The wistful look on Berta's face made Fiona's heart soften. She sipped her tea and studied the older woman. It must be heart-wrenching to love someone that belonged to another all this time. "Have you seen Ed?" Berta asked, breaking into Fiona's thoughts. "Is he okay?" "I haven't seen him in years, not since the restraining order. But now that Prudence is gone, maybe..." "Restraining order?" Berta waved her arms. "Oh, it was silly. Prudy took it out on me years ago, saying I threatened her. But I think she just didn't want me near Ed. She was jealous of me, you know." Fiona and Morgan exchanged another glance. Could Berta have killed Prudence? Apparently she'd already threatened her. "Were you at home that morning?" Fiona asked. Berta looked at her blankly, then said, "Oh, you mean when Prudence was killed? I believe I was at the dentist. Oh, wait, that was Tuesday, right? That's the day I get my hair done." "Why do you ask?" "Just wondering if you saw anything or heard anything." "Oh, no. Well, I'm pretty far off the beaten path here," Berta answered. "Is there anyone else you can think of who might have killed Prudence?" Morgan asked. Berta pursed her lips and then shook her head. "I really don't know. I hate to say it, but whoever killed her did us all a favor." Fiona wiped the cookie crumbs from her lips and stood up. "Thanks for the tea and cookies. Can we help you clean up?" "Oh, no, dear. You girls run along. Thank you for bringing me these lovely teas." She indicated the basket Morgan had given her. Berta ushered them out through the living room and onto the porch, waving goodbye with her good arm before she shut the door. Fiona turned to Morgan on the way to the car. "Do you think she did it?" Morgan glanced back at the house. "That nice old lady? Would she even have the strength?" 50 years of pent-up hatred might give her the strength. And her wrist? What if she injured it in the struggle with Prudence? Morgan chewed her bottom lip. She could have, but she said it was sprained last week, before the murder. "We need to check with Doc Brundage and see if we can verify that. And we should also make sure she really was getting her hair done that morning." "I don't feel like we are any closer to figuring out who killed Prudence. In fact, it sounds like Berta, Josiah, and maybe even Ed would have had a motive." Morgan opened the passenger door to the truck and turned to look at Fiona as she crossed in front of it to the driver's side. Yeah, it does. Maybe all three of them teamed up and did it together. Fiona raised her brows as she swung herself up into the driver's seat. I guess there's only one way to find out. Interview the others and see who has an alibi for that morning. Chapter 14. Fiona pulled up in front of Sticks and Stones and cut the engine in her truck. The mid-afternoon sun filtered through the trees, creating a fairy tale-like atmosphere. She leaned back in her seat, listening to the bees buzzing and the birds chirping, while she admired the azaleas in full bloom on either side of the cottage. A stone pathway led up to the porch in front, where Morgan had put out several rocking chairs. One of which, she noticed with a start, was rocking on its own. No, not on its own. Belladonna lay curled on the seat, her white fur almost blending with the white wicker of the chair. "Did you leave Belladonna out this morning?" she asked Morgan. "No. You know I always lock her inside. Why?" Fiona pointed, and Morgan followed the direction of her finger, her eyes widening when she noticed the cat. How the heck did she get here? Fiona shrugged, opening her door. I thought I'd seen her darting around town before. I have no idea how she gets out. Maybe Jolene lets her out. Or maybe she has some secret escape route through the basement, Morgan mused as the girls slid out of the truck. One we didn't find as kids? Fiona's lips turned up in a smile as she remembered the fun they used to have as kids, exploring the nooks and crannies of the giant basement in their old home. They had always fantasized about secret tunnels that led to the ocean, but of course, they never found any. A memory tugged at the corner of her mind, one that did involve secret tunnels and caverns in the cliffs under her home. Just a silly childhood fantasy, she figured, even though the memory did seem very real, if a bit fuzzy. Meow. Belladonna hopped down from the chair and wound her way in between Morgan's legs. Don't try to get in my good graces. You're a bad kitty for straying so far from home. You could get hurt. Morgan bent to pick the cat up, while Fiona unlocked the door to their shop. Once inside, Morgan gave Belladonna a kiss on the forehead. Then the cat squirmed away, jumping down to the floor, where she proceeded to slink her way around the shop, sniffing and exploring, while Morgan and Fiona got to work. The rest of the afternoon was a whirlwind of activity. Fiona had worried that Morgan's arrest would be bad for business, but in fact, the opposite was true. It seemed everyone in the area wanted to stop in and get an herbal remedy, tea, or buy some crystals or jewelry as an excuse to talk about the murder. Morgan mixed up herbal remedies to treat seasickness, insect bites, arthritis pain, and flatulence. Fiona sold several crystal spheres, 2 of her best geodes, and 3 pairs of earrings. Belladonna lounged on top of the bookshelf by the door, where Morgan kept her books on herbs, stretched out along the top with her tail curled over the edge as if she didn't have a care in the world. By 5:30, both girls were exhausted and ready to close up for the day. Fiona was doing one last adjustment to her jewelry display, which meant she was bent over the case, her backside high in the air, when the bell above the door chimed. My, what an outstanding view. Fiona's heart jerked, and she whirled around at the sound of the raspy voice. Eli Stark stood in the doorway, his beady black eyes still staring at the spot where her backside had been just seconds before. What do you want? Morgan narrowed her eyes at him. Belladonna took one look at him, arched her back, and hissed from the top of the bookshelf, causing Stark to jerk sideways. What's that?
Our cat.
Morgan laughed. It's our cat. Seems she doesn't like you.
Good.
Stark gave Belladonna a long glare, then turned his attention back to Morgan. I just came by to see if you ladies had changed your mind about selling this property. I figured you might need money with your new lawyer bills and all. He smirked. Morgan tilted her chin in the air. We have no intention of selling. Right, Fee? Stark turned his leering gaze on Fiona, who straightened up in front of the case. That's right. And if we were going to sell, it certainly wouldn't be to you. Stark walked toward Fiona, stopping a mere inch from where she stood. She backed up a step, bumping into the display case, which prevented her from getting further away. Stark leaned into her, his greasy black hair dangling down beside his face. Well, I hope you girls change your mind. I'd hate to see you struggle for money in order to get your sister's name cleared. Fiona's stomach dropped when he reached out to touch a lock of her hair. She slapped his hand away, shrinking back. Get out! Suddenly, someone grabbed Stark from behind and spun him around. Fiona's eyes widened in surprise when she saw Jake Cooper standing there,
Aww.
looking down at Stark. You heard the lady, Jake said, pointing toward the door. Get out. Stark straightened his back and sidestepped away from Jake, making his way to the door. He paused at it and turned. If you ladies change your minds, you know where to find me. He opened the door, but before he could escape, Belladonna hissed and batted him with her claws. Stark swatted at her, but she was too quick for him. He turned back to glare at Fiona, then disappeared through the door. What was that all about? Jake swiveled his head, looking first at Fiona, then at Morgan. Fiona let out a long breath. That's Eli Stark, a real estate developer. He's been after us to sell this piece of land, so he can build condos or something. Thanks for scaring him off, Morgan said to Jake. We could have taken care of him ourselves. Fiona crossed her arms against her chest. What can we help you with? Jake raised his eyebrows and looked back at Morgan. Fiona noticed that he wasn't wearing his cop uniform, which hopefully meant he wasn't there on police business. But then, why was he there? She let her eyes wander over the plain gray t-shirt he wore and noticed uncomfortably that the shirt accentuated his broad shoulders and extra-large biceps, making her wonder what was under the rest of it. Her gaze seemed to have a mind of its own and made its way down to his trim waist. He was wearing faded jeans, and Fiona felt her cheeks grow hot when she started to imagine what was under them. I asked him to come here. Jake's going to help us. Morgan's words caused Fiona to rip her gaze from Jake and focus it on her sister. What? Why? She sputtered. I thought we needed some help finding the killer, Morgan said. Fiona narrowed her eyes. I don't think we can trust anyone but ourselves to do that. Look, it's clear that Overton wants to pin this on me. I have no idea why, but I'm pretty sure having someone on the inside can't hurt. Fiona nodded her head toward Jake. But he could be feeding everything you tell him to Overton. Morgan looked over at Jake, who stood quietly in the middle of the room, swiveling his head back and forth as if at a tennis match, while he watched the two sisters battle it out. Fiona noticed Belladonna had wandered over to make his acquaintance, which consisted of weaving in and out between his ankles. I don't think so. My gut instincts tell me we can trust him. Besides, Jake has plenty of detective experience from his last job. He could be an invaluable asset. Fiona felt butterflies in her stomach. The trouble was, she couldn't be sure if it was trepidation at letting Jake help them, or the fact that she kept noticing that he looked pretty good out of his cop clothes.
Oh?
Finally, she took a deep breath and let it out. Okay, fine. It's your ass on the line. She waved a hand in the air. Great. Now that we have that settled, let's talk about what we plan to do, Jake said, bending down to pet Belladonna, who mewed appreciatively. Fiona finished putting her tools away and flipped the sign on the shop door to closed, while Morgan told Jake about their visit to Berta Crumb. Jake leaned against the counter in front of Morgan. Fiona could tell he was listening intently. Maybe he would be helpful. Morgan's gut instincts about people were usually right. But Fiona couldn't help but feel a little nervous about letting a stranger try to help with something so important. Those sound like good leads to follow up on, Jake said. I could check with the hospital to see when Berta was treated for that sprain. I also think we need to go look at the place where Prudence was killed, Morgan said. I was thinking the very same thing, Jake answered. I'm sure there must be something there we missed. Overton didn't give us a lot of time there. Why do you think Overton is so hot to arrest Morgan?
Okay, so guys, I'm gonna make this kind of like a two-parter. I'll be back. Okay, see ya.